Helen Lenskyj is the renowned author of 3 books, Inside the Olympic Industry, Best Olympics Ever, and most recently Olympic Industry Resistance, Challenging Olympic Power and Propaganda. And then after her we are also presenting Gord Hill, who works with the Olympic Resistance Network and is the editor of the absolutely phenomenal website no2010.com, which really is one of the most comprehensive collections of information.
There's been a pattern, and Vancouver is typical, unfortunately. If we thought that Canada was sort of a more democratic and fairer and more just society than the US or Australia, you know, gentler, kinder than recent host countries, and that Vancouver would do things differently, they're not, unfortunately. The poorest neighbourhoods are routinely targeted for development, and we see this in the downtown east side. Displacement of low-income residents, destruction of long-standing working-class communities. These are routine in Olympic host cities. And then all the benefits, the people who get richer are developers, resort and hotel owners, real estate industry, big business, the television networks, so on. And the poor disproportionately bear the burden. And then there's this lovely idea of legacy, as if some gifts are dropping from the sky when you host the Olympics. A sort of a windfall profit of infrastructure and housing and sporting facilities. And they are, the public money isn't taken into account when people talk about legacy. So the bottom line is you get what you pay for, whether you want it or not. If you want a luge run in Whistler, or a speed skating arena in Vancouver, or a velodrome in Atlanta, or a whitewater rafting course in London, whether the local residents want and need that kind of sporting facility or not, you have to have it because it's the Olympics. It's part of the blueprint, and that creates a problem. That it might be a white elephant, very likely is. Sydney, Australia has a lot of white elephant venues, and the New South Wales government, the minute the Olympics left, started pouring millions of dollars into the area around Homebush Bay where all the stadiums were to try to get them to be used, because they've got an oversupply of stadiums now in Sydney. Another kind of legacy, you know, and this is a catchphrase, that having all these sparkling new facilities will be good for our children, that will have a whole generation who are inspired to take up speed skating or luge or whatever, because we've now got the facilities. And a colleague of mine in Sydney, Australia, who's actually was a member of the organising committee. She's an academic, Christine Toohey, and she was commissioned to write the report of the Sydney Olympics. So she, in many respects, had a vested interest. You know, she was an insider and not very critical. But she recently presented a paper at the University of Toronto to see whether or not there really was an increase in sporting participation following Sydney 2000, because now so many communities had state-of-the-art sporting facilities, and a whole generation of children watched television or perhaps went to some events and got inspired, and they had wonderful role models and so on and so on. So she wanted to see if that really produced increases in sporting participation, and she relied on 2 major surveys of participation across Australia. One was done by a private research company called the Sweeney Report, and the other was done by the Australian Sports Commission. And they both found that there was no increase in participation in the sports that were Olympic sports in Sydney 2000. And there was greater passive involvement. So there were more people watching sport on TV after compared to before. I probably don't have to tell you anything about Vancouver and Sam Sullivan and the Civil City Report and all that kind of thing, but just a few points. To start with, you had the inner city inclusivity statement, right? Part of the bid sounded beautiful, said that there would, housing would be protected, people's rights would be protected, homeless people, and so on. Then you have Sam Sullivan with the Civil City Report saying without evidence that there was a big increase in public disorder, and actually there was evidence to the contrary. There were successful community-based efforts to address poverty, homelessness and drug abuse, decreases in every major crime indicator in the preceding 10 years. And it was the nasty language in this report is probably one of the most offensive aspects of it, that there's a group called The Public, and I don't think anyone in this room would be Sam Sullivan's The Public, because the public are the tourists with money in their pockets, not the people with not much money or the people asking for money. They're not the public. So the people that the report demonized were homeless or had physical or mental health problems. They weren't the so-called law-abiding citizens, or particularly they weren't the Downtown Business Improvement Association people, because they were very concerned about urban decline, so-called. So this Civil City Report was trying to increase the public's sense of personal safety at the cost of other people's personal safety, namely homeless people. And it was very much like Atlanta, that homeless people were characterized as what I called urban vermin, literally. And the idea of making sure that dumpsters were locked so that homeless people couldn't get food out of dumpsters is very similar to Atlanta, where restaurant owners were told to pour bleach over the food that they dumped out the back of their restaurants. And then he wanted parking ticket enforcement people and garbage collectors to be the, quote, the new eyes and ears on the street to help local police and security officers. So again, very similar. And Atlanta had the games in 1996, that's 13 years ago. And by 2000, there was almost complete privatization of downtown public space, formerly public space. The security officers were ticketing van drivers who were distributing food to homeless people in that area. And there were attempts, the mayor of Atlanta attempted to ban feeding the homeless in public on the grounds that it was a health hazard. And by 2006, nearly 70 Olympic cities had criminalized begging or lying down in public places, and 5 US cities had banned food distribution in public places. Now that is a pattern that we've seen in a lot of host cities. In Sydney, because of the tireless work of anti-Olympic activists who belong to organizations like anti-poverty, homeless advocates, environmentalists, civil liberties, human rights organizations, they all work together, and the treatment of homeless people was nowhere near as bad as many of us had thought it would be in Sydney. A lot of people were moved out for a short period, but they were treated humanely. And the ones who stayed in the city, there was a homeless protocol put in place where volunteers from a lawsuit, a bit like Pivot, a legal aid organisation, volunteers were in the police cars when they were patrolling streets and attempting to move on homeless people who were sleeping in public places. And they protected the rights. They got this through this homeless protocol that they worked on in collaboration with the police. I'll just read a short list of recommendations, but that are on the last page of the book. On the last page of my first book, I called, and that was released in 2000, Inside the Olympic Industry, Power, Politics and Activism. I called for the dismantling of the Olympic industry, for what good it did, but that's what I wanted. I said that people who love sport and care about social justice, and there are people who do both, should be directing their energies to other international sporting competition that doesn't have the horrendous reputation of the Olympics, isn't tainted with all those negatives. In this book I say, and these are more sort of liberal approaches, I'm all for a range of approaches, including radical, including direct action. So, lobbying elected politicians at every level, supporting local government candidates who run on an Olympic watchdog or an anti-Olympic bid platform, and I know that's had its ups and downs in Vancouver because there was a group with that platform and then their numbers kind of got decimated, and here we are. Demanding responsible investigative journalism on the part of mainstream media, supporting and participating in independent media websites to circulate alternative views and visions, peaceful protests, non-violent direct action, supporting whistleblowers within every sector of the Olympic industry, boycotting Olympic sponsors and telling them why, working with public intellectuals, lobbying school boards to screen Olympic educational materials, developing community-based alternatives to the Olympic role model approach, and refusing to allow children and youth to be exploited by the Olympic industry.